Welcome back. Tributes have continued to pour in after the death of former Finance Minister and South African Reserve Bank Governor Tito Mboweni, who is remembered for his sharp focus on fiscal discipline, economic transformation, and also his culinary skills. Now, Mboweni died over the weekend at a Johannesburg hospital after a short illness. This was announced by his family. A lot of the discussion was of Mboweni taking the economy, which had, of course, gone through the COVID-19 pandemic. But it wasn't just the COVID-19 pandemic. It came from a period where the economy went through some turbulence post-state capture. Joining us now to unpack some of his economic nous and some of the contributions that he had brought as the head of Treasury, I'd like to welcome Stanlib chief economist Kevin Lings. Kevin, good day. Thank you so much for joining us here on News in Focus on Hilaal TV.
Yeah, pleasure. Just a bit of a sad news around Tito. He was very well respected, and I think for most people, just a major shock. Because at the age of 65, a young guy, and I think most people were not aware of any illness. So it certainly is a shock in the economics community, and I think generally within the public sector.
Yeah, I actually wanted to touch on that. I mean, when we speak of Tito Mboweni, I think his Twitter, his X timeline was filled of Lucky Star and, of course, his culinary skills that he showed us on his kitchen. Kevin, let's talk of that COVID-19 pandemic, because here we have the world's economy going through a very difficult time. What is your assessment of Tito Mboweni during, those close to 2-year period where South Africa was in that difficult position?
Yeah, so he took over the role of Minister of Finance at a very difficult time. It wasn't just the COVID era that we were going through. It was also that the fiscal position had deteriorated very dramatically. South Africa's credit rating had been moved to below investment grade. We were struggling to attract foreign investment, and the situation appeared to continue to deteriorate. And so his role was to provide much needed stability and to try and put South Africa's fiscal position on a better track. So he certainly had his work cut out, and he had many factors that were stacking against him, if you like. At the same time, his situation was made much more difficult by the fact that South Africa's economic growth was very weak, and that you don't have the natural windfall of better growth, better tax revenue, and a government that was set on discipline. The government had gone through a phase of significant increase in employment, significant salary adjustments, deterioration in the finances for state-owned enterprises. So it wasn't just state capture. It was also that other areas were not being well managed. And so yeah, it was a major challenge for him to try and set us on a better path.
And of course, he came from that experience, being the South African Reserve Bank governor. He served on many boards, post that. From an economics perspective, how do you, or actually, I may say, where do you rate Tito Mboweni in terms of the economical mind that South Africa possessed, at the start of the democracy?
So, I think he made a huge contribution to South Africa's economic environment in various ways. Obviously, he started his political life in government as the Minister of Labour. And I guess to some extent, Labour still credits him for some of the legislation that they've enjoyed. I'm not sure that later on, Tito was that convinced about his own legislation that he got enacted, but I think the labor movement still gave him an element of credit for having put that labor legislation in place. And I think at that stage you would have considered him to be very much left-wing focused in terms of his economics and his desire for government to get more involved in how the economy functions. But over time, particularly in his role as in Reserve Bank, he changed, his mindset changed. He understood better what the international backdrop was like. He went to Davos on a regular basis. He started to understand global investors. And I think that brought a new awareness of the role of central banks for South Africa and in the world economy, the importance of foreign investment, the importance of fiscal discipline and monetary discipline. And remember that when he became governor of the Reserve Bank, prior to that, there was no inflation target. And so he was the first governor that had to try and deal with this unknown factor, an inflation target. And I think he did a remarkable job in getting that in place and getting the Reserve Bank to adhere to that. Also, I think one of the things that for me will always remember is that he was fiercely independent. He was loyal. He was loyal to the ANC. He was loyal to his colleagues and comrades, but he understood that in order for him to do his job effectively, he needed to be independent and not politically swayed, particularly in his role as the Reserve Bank governor. And I think he entrenched that idea for subsequent governors. So Jill Marcus, I think, benefited from that. Lesetja now is benefiting from that. And so I think he set the tone for how monetary policy in South Africa was going to be conducted. Obviously, that allowed for a huge amount of credibility to be established around his persona, around his integrity. And so when he moved into being Minister of Finance, he already had a huge belief that he would do the right thing. And it's very rare, actually, for a person to be both Minister of Finance and Reserve Bank governor. And I think he did both jobs very well. So he will leave a legacy that is enormous, and people will reflect on the achievement that he put in place for many years to come. And there's no doubt that it's a very substantial, significant achievement. It will also, by the way, be taught in universities around how to implement monetary policy effectively to meet an inflation target. It's a very good case study of what was required, how you shape inflation expectations, how you message monetary policy. There was a lot that went into it. So I think his legacy is very rich, and certainly his family can be very proud of the contribution he's made.
Taking the top spot of Treasury is a poison chalice because you're dealing with the public purse. And then at the same time, he had to balance that with labor. And you see many, labor unions coming out and actually praising him. It's not very often you see that happening. You even see opposition parties going ahead and praising the work that Mboweni did. How was he able to really navigate that, to try and make sure, all right, I have to keep the private sector, happy, but also at the same time, majority of the workforce in South Africa needs to have a better living conditions. He was able to do that, and he was able really to find that supposed middle ground in that.
I think so. I think he was able to achieve that. Obviously, his role as Minister of Finance had some tough times because at the time there was a phase when he was trying to cut the number of people employed in government. He was very active in trying to enforce that. He was very active in trying to ensure that salary increases were brought very substantially under control. And at that point, there was a conflict between him and the trade unions, understandably so. But I think where he had a special role was that, firstly, as I said, he had developed a lot of the labor legislation in the early days, and he understood what labor had been going through, and he understood the type of legislation that was in place and what the spirit of that legislation was trying to achieve. So he could relate very easily, I think, to the trade unions. And then on the other side, I think he achieved a lot by his own credibility. It was very difficult to be critical of the role that he had played. And therefore, when you're sitting across the table from somebody who has established a high level of credibility, you have to take the person seriously. You have to respect them. You can't easily undermine them because you will recognize that he's got to this role out of a huge amount of effort and hard work and diligence, etc. So I personally think it was his achievements along the way that allowed for people to respect him no matter who he was up against, who he was negotiating with. That doesn't mean that it was an easy role for him as Minister of Finance. I don't think so at all. And I think he ended up with quite a lot of conflict with within the political alliance, amongst the political alliance partners. And so he needed to stick to the mandate he'd been given, and he had to be willing to confront the alliance partners on some of the objectives. And there was no doubt that that was a hard road to walk, because he wouldn't have had huge support from other cabinet members. When you're the Minister of Finance and you're trying to control the government fiscal position, it's not like everybody's supporting you. There are many people within your own ranks that would like you to be more relaxed with government spending, etc. So it's a tough road, and I think he just had the inherent credibility and the charisma to make it work.
Kevin, one final question. I've just got a minute. The austerity measures, especially at a time of COVID-19, it needed to be stricter, it needed to be harder, it needed to be something which could keep the public purse going. Just your take on how difficult it was at the time for Mboweni to really maintain those strict measures of austerity.
So enormously difficult, because you'll recognize that tax revenue was under enormous pressure. We had very little economic activity. You had people that were losing jobs. You had a huge increase in number of people applying for social payments. The government was under pressure to implement the social relief of distress grant, which eventually it did. And then obviously there were a lot of businesses who were looking for support. And you saw that internationally. It cost governments a huge amount. And so you had to try and balance that against the reality. And the reality was a very high debt level that was going to get way out of control unless government could be disciplined. And he very much was able to illustrate the risks. He was able to articulate that if we don't do the right thing, the path going forward is not going to be a good outcome. And so I think by starkly indicating which direction we were heading, he was able to get people to realize that we had no choice, that government had to be more disciplined, otherwise the outcome would be way worse. And so he was able to become quite effective at a very difficult time.
Kevin, thank you so much for joining us on News in Focus on Hilaal TV. Much appreciated.
Sure, pleasure.
That's Kevin Lings, Chief Economist at Stanlib, of course. One of the memories I would take from Tito Mboweni is him comparing the economy to his aloe vera plant. He even brought it to the National Assembly just to illustrate it, the importance of that. And of course, everyone knows the culinary skills he had. And if you were following him on X, you would really go ahead and see his skills in the kitchen. A top-class guy, a gentleman, and a finance minister that was able to manage South Africa's economy during these difficult times. Our hats off to you, Mr. Tito Titus Mboweni. That's all we have for you here on News in Focus. From myself, Faraz Patel, and the rest of the team in Johannesburg. Don't forget to follow us on all our social media channels, and also subscribe to YouTube Hilaal TV. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.